In the arid lands near Tikrit, a boy was born in 1937 into a world already marked by loss. Saddam Hussein entered life in the village of Halabja without a father, raised by a mother who struggled against the harsh realities of their world. It was an upbringing steeped in the ancient codes of honor and retribution, where violence was not an event, but the very air one breathed. As a young man, he found his calling in the Ba'ath Party, a movement fueled by grand visions of Arab unity. But beneath its soaring rhetoric lay a dark machinery of conspiracy and assassination. Within this crucible of ambition, Saddam proved a natural, his ruthlessness a chilling asset in a party that valued power above all else. When the Ba'athists seized Iraq in 1968, Saddam was not the face of the revolution, but its hidden engine. While his cousin, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, held the title of president, it was Saddam who quietly built the architecture of control. By 1979, the charade was over. Al-Bakr was forced aside, and Saddam stepped from the shadows to claim the presidency for himself. From that moment, his absolute rule began, cloaked in the language of progress. Saddam envisioned a formidable modern Iraq, a leader in the Arab world, and he poured the nation's wealth into creating this image. Gleaming government buildings rose into the Baghdad sky. Universities expanded their halls, and women were encouraged into medicine, engineering, and teaching. On the surface, it was a new dawn of opportunity. Yet beneath this polished veneer of modernity, a deep and chilling fear took root. Every advancement was governed by the state's unblinking eye. The Mukhabarat, Saddam's secret police, were a phantom presence in every office, classroom, and home. Their gaze felt even when unseen. For countless families, the terror was intimate and devastating. A sudden knock on the door in the dead of night. A wife could become a widow overnight, a sister left to raise her siblings, a mother condemned to a life of desperate, silent waiting for a son who would never return. To even ask for news was to risk being branded an enemy of the state, forcing a terrible silence upon their grief. The fear that gripped Iraq from within was about to be matched by a new horror from without. For in the autumn of 1980, the nation's gaze was forced toward its eastern border. A shadow fell across the borderlands, silent at first, then thunderous. What Saddam Hussein envisioned as a swift victory, a campaign of mere months, instead unspooled into 8 agonizing years of conflict. It became one of the 20th century's most brutal wars, a maelstrom that consumed cities, erased entire villages, and fed endless waves of young men into the grinding machinery of the front lines. For the women of Iraq, this was not a distant conflict fought on a map, but a daily nightmare that arrived at their doorsteps. With so many men swallowed by the war, the very fabric of society was rewoven by female hands. Mothers became sole providers, raising children alone in the long shadow of an absent father. Schoolyards emptied as teenage girls took their places in markets, shops, and fields, their own futures sacrificed. The air itself seemed to carry the sounds of loss, the constant rhythm of funeral processions, and the piercing wails of grieving mothers. Widows, cloaked in black, became a fixture in every neighborhood, a living testament to the nation's grief. But the war's suffering was not confined to the battlefield. It became a weapon for the regime itself, a pretext to tighten its suffocating grip. To question the conflict, to even whisper a complaint about the hardship, was to be branded a traitor. For women whose husbands fell under suspicion, the consequences were swift and brutal. They were the ones dragged into the chilling silence of detention centers, their bodies and spirits broken through humiliation and assault. Many simply vanished behind those walls, leaving behind children who would grow up as orphans, forever haunted by a truth they would never know. Even outside the prisons, fear was a constant companion, as Saddam's intelligence services cast a net of surveillance across the country. A single letter from a relative abroad, or one incautious word, could destroy an entire household. While propaganda posters celebrated a fiction of heroic women in factories and hospitals, the reality was one of unbearable pain. By the time the guns fell silent in 1988, more than 500,000 souls from both sides were lost, and millions more were wounded or displaced. Iraq was a nation bled dry of money, hope, and life, its roads, schools, and families lying in ruins. Women bore the deepest scars, both visible and hidden. And yet, the silence that followed the war was not the silence of peace. For them, the darkest years were still to come. The echoes of one war had barely faded before the drums of another began to beat, this time within Iraq's own borders. As the 1980s drew to a close, Saddam Hussein's attention pivoted north toward the Kurdish people. Their long-held dream of independence had led some to side with Iran during the recent war, a choice Saddam considered an unforgivable act of treason. He no longer saw them as citizens, but as a hostile presence to be purged from his land. In 1987, he unleashed a campaign of extermination codenamed Anfal. At its helm was his cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, a man who would earn the chilling moniker Chemical Ali. This was not a war against rebels. It was a systematic effort to erase Kurdish existence. Bulldozers tore through ancient villages, fertile farmland was scorched to black earth, and families were swept up in brutal dragnets. Before it was over, more than 100,000 Kurds would be dead, their communities wiped from the very map of Iraq. The weight of this horror fell most heavily upon Kurdish women. As soldiers stormed their villages, men were often executed where they stood, while women and children were violently separated. Herded onto trucks, they were hauled away to desolate prisons and detention camps. Some faced firing squads, their bodies discarded in mass graves, while others endured systematic sexual violence. Teenage girls, some as young as 12, were swallowed by the walls of military compounds, vanishing without a trace, leaving a silence their families could never fill. For the survivors, the camps were a living hell, a place of profound humiliation and squalid conditions with little food or water. Mothers fought to shield their children, only to watch helplessly as they succumbed to starvation and disease. In a final act of cruelty, even grief was forbidden. The world would come to know this campaign through one name above all: Halabja. In March of 1988, the town was drenched in poison gas, killing 5,000 civilians in a single day and leaving bodies frozen in the streets. Yet behind the stark headline of Halabja lay the quieter, unrecorded agonies of thousands of other Kurdish women. Many lost their entire families in a single brutal sweep. Displaced and alone, some were forced into marriages against their will, while others carried the deep wounds of their trauma in silence for the rest of their lives. By August of 1990, with his internal enemies crushed, Saddam's gaze turned beyond his borders toward a new and more audacious prize. In the late summer heat, another line was drawn in the sand. Saddam Hussein sent his army rolling into the small, oil-rich nation of Kuwait, an act of aggression that stunned the international community and tipped the delicate balance of power in the Middle East. In response, a massive global coalition led by the United States began to assemble. By January of 1991, the skies over Iraq erupted in fire and thunder as the Gulf War commenced. For weeks, coalition forces unleashed a relentless air campaign, shattering bridges, silencing power plants, and fracturing the systems that delivered clean water. The Iraqi army, though immense in number, was systematically dismantled by a technologically superior force. By the end of February, Saddam's soldiers were in full retreat and Kuwait was liberated. But while the dictator remained enthroned in Baghdad, his country was a landscape of ruin. The war had gutted Iraq's infrastructure, plunging its people into a desperate struggle for survival. In the silence left by the bombers, ordinary citizens, especially women and children, bore the heaviest cost. The United Nations then imposed a crushing regime of sanctions intended to punish Saddam, but which instead crippled an entire society. The embargo choked off the flow of essential goods, turning everyday life into a grim ordeal. Food grew scarce, and vital medicines like antibiotics became nearly impossible to obtain. Mothers watched helplessly as their children wasted away from hunger and treatable illnesses, the basic necessities of life suddenly beyond their reach. United Nations reports would later reveal the horrifying scale of the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of children dead from malnutrition and disease throughout the 1990s. Behind each number was a family shattered, and a mother who carried the impossible weight of survival in a nation collapsing around her. Yet even in this landscape of despair, a darker shadow was lengthening, for Saddam's power was not his alone. It was shared by his two sons, Uday and Qusay. In the shadow of the regime, two names became whispers of dread, a darkness born not of war, but of the whims of two brothers. Both were heirs to absolute power, yet instead of fortifying their nation, they used their privilege to indulge a shared bottomless cruelty. Of the two, it was the elder son, Uday, whose name was spoken with the most profound terror. His violence was a storm without warning, his appetites insatiable. His motorcades would glide through the streets of Baghdad, his guards scanning the crowds, plucking young women from the fabric of their daily lives, from university courtyards, from family weddings, from the very steps of their homes. Once taken to his palace, many were never seen again, their fates swallowed by rumors too horrific to voice. Mothers taught their daughters to become invisible, to mute their beauty and stifle their laughter, for a single glance from Uday could extinguish a future in an instant. His depravity reached its apex in the desecration of life's most sacred moments. A wedding celebration could be shattered by the arrival of his entourage, the groom beaten or killed, the bride stolen away before the eyes of her helpless family. To defy Saddam's son was to invite certain death. While Uday's brutality was a public spectacle, his younger brother Qusay operated in the chilling silence of the state's hidden machinery. As the master of Iraq's security apparatus, he commanded the Republican Guard and the intelligence services, and with them, a sprawling network of prisons. Within those walls, suffering was a calculated instrument of control. Women endured systematic torture and degradation, some held as leverage against dissident husbands or brothers, their bodies turned into weapons against their own families. Together, the brothers forged a prison without walls. On the streets, Uday's predatory gaze was a constant threat. In the state's dungeons, Qusay's institutionalized cruelty ensured that even the broken could be pushed further into despair. In this world, a woman's safety could vanish in a heartbeat, and no family, no matter how loyal, was ever truly safe. In the sprawling network of state terror, some names were whispered with a unique dread. While no family felt entirely secure, certain prisons held a darkness that eclipsed all others. Long before its infamy reached the wider world in 2003, Abu Ghraib was already a symbol of ultimate fear for Iraqis. It was a place where women vanished into the depths, their fates sealed in a silence that families dared not break by asking questions. Many of these women had committed no crime at all. Their transgressions were often slight, a hushed criticism of Saddam's rule, a quiet refusal to swear allegiance to the Ba'ath Party. Others were imprisoned simply for their connections, their freedom forfeited because a husband, brother, or son had dared to dissent or flee. The regime's logic was cruel and absolute, punishing women not for their actions but for the men in their lives. Inside the suffocating confines of a cell, survival became a desperate calculation. Food was a privilege, medicine was withheld, and disease festered in the close, foul air. Yet the deepest wounds were inflicted by design. Survivors would later recount how sexual violence was systematically weaponized, an instrument of control wielded with chilling precision. The suffering was often staged, performed before male relatives to utterly demolish a family's spirit and extinguish any spark of resistance. For the few who were released, the prison gates opened into a world of new torment. In a society where rape carried a profound stigma, a woman's ordeal was far from over. Many were cast out by their own families, treated as guilty participants rather than victims. Some chose a life of silent isolation, while others faced a final brutal judgment from relatives who believed their honor had been irrevocably tainted. While concrete walls crushed lives in the cities, a different form of devastation was unfolding far away, among the women of the marshes. Away from the shattered cities, a different kind of suffering was unfolding in the quiet wetlands of the south. Here, for countless centuries, the marsh Arabs had built a civilization from water and reeds, their lives moving to the ancient rhythms of fishing, farming, and herding water buffalo. This entire way of life, passed down through generations, was anchored by the women who cared for the children, prepared the food, and served as the keepers of tradition. But in the aftermath of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein's gaze fell upon the marshes, and he saw not a culture, but a nest of enemies. Accusing them of hiding rebels and fueling uprisings, he unleashed an ecological war to punish them. Massive canals and dams were constructed to bleed the wetlands dry, turning one of the Middle East's greatest natural treasures into a cracked and barren wasteland. Villages that had floated for centuries were left stranded and broken in the dust. For the women, the stewards of family and home, the desolation was absolute. With their livestock dying and their source of life gone, they could no longer feed their children. Entire families were forced onto the desiccated earth, walking for miles in a desperate search for water, mothers carrying infants as older children struggled to keep pace. Disease swept through the displaced, and medical care was a distant memory. On top of this slow, grinding destruction came the sharp terror of military raids. Soldiers descended upon the vulnerable families, and women often bore the brunt of their cruelty. Some were beaten or assaulted during brutal searches, while others were forced to witness the execution of their husbands and sons. For many, the only choice left was to flee, becoming refugees in Iran and leaving behind the land that had sustained their people for millennia. The loss was not just physical, but cultural, a severing of roots. The songs, the crafts, the unique knowledge passed from mother to daughter for 1,000 years were now being erased, left to perish alongside their ruined homes. In the suffocating quiet of Saddam's Iraq, the most dangerous frontiers were not on a battlefield, but inside the walls of the family home. Saddam understood an insidious truth, that ultimate power grew not from the barrel of a gun, but from the fear that poisoned a family from within. He wielded women as weapons to punish and pressure entire bloodlines. If a man was accused of disloyalty, the regime's retribution rarely fell on him alone. Instead, it was his wife, his sisters, or his daughters who would bear the weight of the state's wrath through arrest, harassment, or situations engineered to shatter their lives. One of the cruelest instruments of this policy was forced marriage, binding women to men loyal to the regime. These unions were not bonds of affection, but chains of control, shackling families to the state and ensuring their silence. For any woman who dared to refuse such an arrangement, the price was unthinkable. She faced the looming threat of brutal violence, the cold darkness of a prison cell, or the agonizing promise of harm to her own children. Even acts of apparent compassion were a veneer for something sinister. So-called charities for widows and mothers were, in truth, elaborate traps designed to keep records, track movements, and place households under constant surveillance. By the early 2000s, Saddam's authority was fracturing under the crushing weight of international sanctions. As the world closed in, his grip on his own people only tightened, convinced that only a deeper terror could hold the nation in line. Public executions became a grotesque spectacle. Women, falsely accused of prostitution, were dragged into the streets and beheaded by militias connected to Saddam's own family. In many cases, these victims were guilty of nothing more than refusing the advances of a powerful man or speaking out against abuse. Their deaths were staged as a brutal lesson meant to scare everyone else into silence. But in March of 2003, the architect of that fear would face a storm gathering far beyond his borders. The final invasion shattered Saddam's ambitions with breathtaking speed. Coalition forces surged across the land, and in a matter of weeks, the entire edifice of his regime crumbled into dust. His opulent palaces were breached, his bronze statues were pulled from their pedestals, and his omnipresent portraits were ripped from walls in a cathartic wave of fury. On the streets, some Iraqis danced in celebration, while others watched in stunned silence, their world dissolving before their eyes. For the women of Iraq, this moment was a fragile dawn. The state-sponsored terror that had haunted their lives was gone. The midnight knock of his soldiers would no longer echo in their hallways. Yet the ensuing chaos birthed new and unpredictable horrors. In the vacuum of power, gangs and extremist militias flourished, and the kidnapping of women became a dark currency in a lawless land. Then, on December 13, 2003, American soldiers found him. Near his hometown, hidden in a cramped subterranean hole, the man who had terrified millions was dragged into the light, disheveled and utterly alone. The dictator who once commanded vast armies was now a captive pulled from the dirt, his power a distant memory. Across Iraq, news of his capture ignited celebrations, and for countless women, it sparked a desperate hope for justice. When Saddam Hussein finally faced a tribunal, he was charged with crimes against humanity, the evidence against him a mountain of sorrow and loss. The court delivered its verdict, and on the 30th of December, 2006, he was executed by hanging. The execution closed a chapter of profound fear, but for the women who had endured his reign, the scars did not fade with his death. They had survived wars, prisons, and the daily terror of his rule. His end offered a measure of closure, but the pain remained, a deep traumatic inheritance passed silently to the generations that followed.